Hey guys, thank you for joining us for another Men's Bible Brief. If you can, join us on Wednesday mornings. The information is on the screen. If not, we got you covered on YouTube right here. Well, let's go ahead and join the brief in progress. God bless you. Hey guys, thank you for joining us again for another Men's Bible Brief. And as we have done every first Wednesday of the month, today is open mic day, as we are definitely taking questions. Hopefully you had a chance to email some of your questions to men@ccrichardson.org, as we want to be able to answer questions from time to time as it relates to the faith, as it relates to issues going on in the culture. And so that's what we're going to do today. Had a few questions today, not a ton, but I thought some very interesting questions that ought to be asked, that hopefully and prayerfully will be beneficial to your spiritual life. And so let's go ahead and jump in and get to the questions. Before we jump into our questions for today, our hump day food for thought is August, an acronym: Ask until God unveils something tangible. That's a wonderful word of encouragement. Questions. And so the first question that we had today, which is a great question: what is soteriology, and how does soteriology relate to the Christian walk? Very great question. Rarely do we get many theology questions. Soteriology is a theological term. Soteria comes from the Greek word soteria, which means salvation. And so soteriology deals with the theological branch or study, ology, obviously the study of salvation. And so this term really looks at the theological trajectory from Genesis to Revelation on the issue of God's rescue. As Christians, we tend to focus more on God's rescue from us from sin to be with him forever. That is the gospel. Christ died for our sins and rose from the dead. And because of that, we'll have an eternal relationship with him. But salvation or soteriology also relates to how God worked in human history. And so here you can think of how God rescued Abraham a number of times, or how God rescued Israel out of the nation of Egypt in terms of their slavery and their oppression. And there are many, many examples. Even in the book of Psalms, the songwriter would testify how God rescued him from the pit. And we do know now that the pit was a metaphor for a pit of sickness. And they thought it was a pit because they didn't think there was any way out. But God touched them, and somehow they were able to come through that sickness in a way that no one ever has. And so though specifically soteriology relates to our salvation, and from a Christian perspective, the gospel and how it saves us for all time, broadly speaking, it relates to how God moves in the experience of humanity to save us from dangers, to save us from trials, to save us from difficulty. And I'm sure there's somebody that's watching now, you personally know what it means for God to save. Not only did he save your life to be a Christian, but he saved you from danger. Or maybe he saved you from financial ruin. Or maybe he saved you from a sickness. Or maybe he saved you from a relationship. In a word, that would be soteriology. And then the second question, or the follow-up question: how does soteriology relate to the Christian walk? Again, those examples that I gave you, how he saves us through life, would be one. But then also two, there's a sense that in salvation, when God saves us for all time through Christ, the gospel, to be with him forever in the kingdom, but God also saves us from ourselves. That even when he saves us, we're not everything that we will be. And so this idea of soteriology, which is called sanctification, God sanctifies, or better, purifies, purges us, that prevents us from being devoted to him or to live for him. And so there's an element of soteriology in which God saves us from ourselves, that we can be saved for God, to serve God, to live for him. And that process is called sanctification. That also is an element of soteriology. that God is constantly working on us. And as I've said time and time again, the Christian faith is a process where God is constantly working to make us more like his Son, to be more like him, to develop desires and passions for him and his way of life every single day as we walk with him. And so that even is an element of salvation. Number 2, explain Calvinism and how it has affected the church. Boy, you talk about a doozy. This was a curveball and a knuckleball and a slider all in one, because I don't know if you can really explain Calvinism in a 2-minute answer or a 5-minute answer. Calvinism starts with a gentleman by the name of John Calvin. He was one of the reformers in which the church went through the Reformation period, which became the Protestant movement, where the church actually split, and that's how we got Catholic and Protestants. And so we're part of what's called the Protestant church. If you grew up Baptist, Pentecostal, Presbyterian, or even non-denomination, as we are as a church, you're a part of the Protestant church. And John Calvin, along with Martin Luther, was one of the architects of this Protestant movement. His theology received quite a bit of attention, though it is argued that many of the future generations took his theology much further than he may have intended. But Calvinism probably is best understood with an acronym, and I'm trying to pull it up here, use my handy Google search bar here. Really, if you want to understand Calvinism, the acronym for TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, is definitely fitting here. And so the T would stand for total depravity. Calvinism promotes the idea that man is completely depraved. He cannot save himself. There's nothing he can possibly merit before a holy God, whether to be accepted by God or even to create a society, if you will, that is of good in and of himself. Unconditional election. In other words, God chooses who's going to be saved and he chooses who will be damned. And there are many who have issues with that, and that's why many are not Calvinists, because in a sense it takes away, particularly in our modern sense of freedom and individualism, it definitely goes across any idea of individualism, but it's unconditional election. That's what the U stands for. Then the L stands for limited atonement. In other words, when Christ died on the cross, he did not die for every single human being, but he only died for the elect, or he died for the chosen. He died for those who would be saved. And you probably can figure out, it is a word about God's complete sovereign control over all human affairs. And that's really what Calvinism is after. And then the I is irresistible grace, meaning that when God's grace is upon you, even if you wanted to, you couldn't resist. Again, you notice it's taken all the individualism out of it. And then the P, perseverance of the saints. That is, it promises that we will complete what God started, because God is the one that's behind it. So it's a heavy, heavy emphasis on the sovereignty of God, to the point that God is the chess master, if you will. And he's moving all the pieces in places. He causes every single thing, good or evil, it doesn't matter. God is working it, moving it, behind it, causing it to happen. So he chooses people for hell. He chooses people for heaven. And for that reason, a lot of people have an issue with Calvinism. I definitely believe historically Calvinism has been part of the problem when it comes to race or racism, because there's a sense that the Genesis 9 passage that cursed Ham was used to justify the cursing of black people, that God actually chose it. God chose us for slavery. God chose us to be hewers of wood. And so those are some of the abuses of this idea and how it has played out. But it is a prominent teaching. There are many good-meaning Christians that I would say that hold to Calvinism. They wouldn't hold to it in that manner as I just described, but they see God in full control of all things. And so that's a very fair question. I think for me, the issue is we really don't know exactly how that plays out with us. There's some people that are so Calvinistic in their thinking, they don't think they have to evangelize because God has already decided who's going to be saved. So why do I need to evangelize? There are even some who would say, why do I need to pray? And because if I pray, I'm asking God to do something that he's already made his mind up to do. So why in the world would I need to pray? And to me, that's when you're taking it way, way too far. And so even though I definitely agree that there is an element there, I probably would agree with it. How it has probably been applied for Christian living would be the problem for me. Number 3, can a person be spiritual without being religious? And I think here what the person is after, the question, or really how this phrase is being used. Can you have a fully functional, vibrant spiritual life without any connection to organized religion, or in our case, institutional Christianity, the institutional church, that is? Can I be a Christian apart from the institutionalized church, the denomination or the structure, or if you're Catholic, the Catholic Church? And I would say, of course, you could be a Christian, but the question is that what Christianity teaches? And the problem is that's not what Christianity teaches. Christianity assumes that we are a part of the church. Why? Because the church is God's family. The church is God's people. And so whatever issues one may have with church authority or the church institution, and some of them are legitimate, we are still called to gather as God's people. And I would further push back and say, for every church that may have offended or brought some shame or hurt in the lives of individuals, God has raised up wonderful, vibrant, spiritual, caring, compassionate churches that we can be a part of, and we can find community and find the safety that we're looking for. And so I'm very careful with that. It's birthed in a context where anything really institutional is to be questioned or rejected. So it's not just church, but it would be the government, it would be business institutions, banking institutions, marriage as an institution, family as an institution, these kinds of traditional institutions that have been the pillars of society. And so that's kind of where that question's coming from. So I'm not going to say a person can't be spiritual without being connected to a church. What I am going to say is that it's not God's will. It's like saying someone can be a good son in a family without ever connecting with their family. Well, it's just inconceivable. Is it possible? Yes. Is it desirable? Absolutely not. And so that's a fair and good question. Number 4, how do we better connect with the younger generations? And this question really came out of just trying to understand the differences between current generation and younger generations. And if you get a chance, you can look at our last service on this YouTube channel where we looked at it. It was our Luau Sunday, and we just had a panel discussion between generations just to talk about differences. And I would say that's probably the biggest thing. I think the problem is we think that there's a perfect generation when since the beginning of time, there's never been one generation that's gotten it perfect. And I think we need to get out of that mindset. And we have to learn to sit down and listen to each other. And just as this younger generation may be a little bit different from previous generations, the same thing was said about my generation when we were young, and even previous generations. It's really not that much different. There may have been different issues, but definitely looked upon in the same way. And so I would say we've got to allow generations to work through, to grow, to be themselves, and to be able to come to the table and have a cross-generational conversation, not for the purpose of judging, not for the purpose of trying to put a straitjacket of codes on anyone, but for understanding, for learning from each other. And I think that's really lost in today's culture and generation. And then the last one, and then we'll be done today. What are God's expectations for sex and sexuality? That's the question that really was asked in the confines of marriage. What is the biblical vision? What is the Christian vision of sexuality, because there's so much out there regarding sexuality that is being said. The question is, well, what exactly is sexuality? Well, I think this is something that never changes. For God and the scriptures and the church has pretty much remained true to this for the last 2,000 years, that sex is something that happens within the confines of marriage. Now, there are many definitions within marriage as to what that means, but as an umbrella principle or vision for the world, sex is something that happens between a man and a woman inside the confines of marriage. And here I'm using Hebrews 13, where the Hebrew writer says that the marriage bed is undefiled. So what a husband and wife does in their bedroom, that's between them and their God, and God sanctions that. Any other sexuality outside of that domain, God does not sanction, God does not honor. And so that's the general principle. And much of today's culture, particularly with this obsession and this inundation with sexuality, wants to expand and look at all the multiple iterations of sexuality. And there's really a push and a rejection of this vision of sexuality. But that's God's vision, and I believe that's the best that He offers, and what's healthy. And I think it's hard to argue that we're in a very difficult place. As much as we have access to sex and pornography today, there's still very little talk at the incredible, almost exponential growth of the sex trade, child pornography, and all the backlash, the fruit of this open sexual culture has actually produced domestic violence, the rise in rapes and what have you, sexual violence. It's just completely off the charts because we've left that vision, or if we've ever had that vision. I think it's fair to ask that question. So I thought that was a very, very good question. There's actually one other question I did leave out that did come up that I wanted to put here at the forefront, and this is question number 7. Is there an identity crisis when it comes to male or masculinity, to men or masculinity? Is there an identity crisis when it comes to masculinity? And I would probably have to agree, at least within the culture, maybe in some respects the church, that yes, there is. I'm actually doing a work on a project to try to bring this to our church and bring this to our men's ministry, to really have a hard conversation and even devotional and begin to develop true biblical Christian manhood. But yes, I would say there's an identity crisis in our culture. Even if you just raise the issue of men being the leaders of their homes, there are those that would push back and see that as misogynistic. And surely there have been some toxic, misogynistic elements of manhood that have been very abusive and problematic in our culture. But Jesus definitely gives us a vision of manhood, one of leadership, one of compassion, one that cares and protects family and children and women, that I think is worthy of maintaining. It doesn't mean that women are second-class citizens. Rather, they are equal partners, even though men are given the leadership baton. I think there's a vision there that I think is very beneficial to communities and cultures around the world. But the pushback and the backlash has really been problematic, and in some respects, yeah, some of the toxic elements, the abusive elements. I definitely don't believe headship is a blank check for sexual or verbal abuse in a relationship, and unfortunately, male leadership in the home or headship has been used under that banner that, hey, I can do whatever I want. And that's the very thing Paul was actually preaching against in his epistles, because in the Roman culture at the time of those household codes and in which husbands and wives and what they were supposed to do and what Paul was recommending, the Roman husband could do whatever he wanted with his wife, whatever he wanted with his slave, and there were no no legal repercussions, no backlash whatsoever. He was the king of his domain. Whether it was violence, he could put children out on the street if he didn't want them. He could violently dismember someone in his family, and there was nothing that could be done because family was seen as a part of his property and his ownership. And I don't believe that is the vision that Paul is ordaining in the household code, specifically in Ephesians and in other places. But rather, he's bringing a sense of a restored manhood vision and a restored leadership vision for men that uplifts women, that uplifts family, and uplifts community and protects communities. And that's what we see in Jesus. That's what we see in the Master in his handling and dealing with women, even in his ministry and dealing with children who were marginalized individuals in that culture. And so I just thought those were some very, very good questions that we had today. Again, if you have questions, men@ccrichardson.org. We would love to answer your questions as we continue this open mic series, and we'll do it every first Wednesday of the month. God bless you. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.